Seeing if we have a camera on. Welcome, everybody. On Sunday mornings, I tend to say, my name is Mike, and I use he, him pronouns. And I'm one of the clergy here. And I say I'm one of the clergy here because when I got here, I had 2 associate rectors, and we were trying not to be too hierarchical. I don't usually say I'm the rector. But tonight it wouldn't matter anyway because I have 2 other rectors here with me. I'm really grateful to Brian Taylor and to Joe Britton for consenting to coming back to a place that had celebrated them and let them go. But we are really, yeah. And Brian, I've joked with the congregation. I said between the 3 of us, we've been rector for over half the history of St. Michael's, but you carried a lot of the water on that one. So it is really good to be here with you all this evening. Thank you for taking a Sunday evening as we celebrate our 75 years as a parish and look forward to the next 75. Kathy Bailey, our stewardship chair, as we were talking about this year, noticed that we, in my first little bit of time as rector, named that we have 3 values as a congregation: welcome, spiritual grounding, and action. And what Kathy said to me this year was, Mike, we've been putting together this timeline and thinking about the 75th year, and what we've noticed is that those 3 values hold across the history of St. Michael's. And so tonight we're going to use those as the structure for our conversation. And I'm going to let both of these 2 basically introduce themselves by answering the question around welcome. What was St. Michael's like when you got here? And what made it a fit for you in those first years when you were rector? And so I don't know who wants to start, but I'll send it off to you.
Is this working okay? You can hear me? Thank you so much for inviting me. It's just, I've been looking forward to this. And I know a little bit more about what's been going on recently than during your years, and so I'm really curious to hear some of that. But let's see, welcome. When we first got here, how many of you lived in the North Valley in the 50s, 60s, or 70s? Raise your hand. A few. Well, you can correct me later on, but our impression when we got here, and I think this is, I hope it's true, is that the North Valley, it's a kind of a remarkable place, and the personality of the North Valley really was expressed in the community of St. Michael and All Angels. It was, you know what this history is probably, the irrigation and farming and people with horses and other animals. There seems to be always attracted a lot of artists and all kinds of people, a lot of diversity in the North Valley. It was always been, my impression, an informal place where this diversity is welcome and celebrated. And St. Michael's was like that. And its informality made me feel right at home, and our family too. And you know, one little example of what that character is like and how it differs from other parts of the city. Some of you remember John Haverland. He was the dean of the cathedral and was the canon of the ordinary for Bishop Steenson, I believe. And we had a fundraiser come in from Milwaukee to help us raise funds for this building. And Bill Durkin was his name, and he went to the bishop's office to talk with John Haverland about, so I want to get to know what's this community like? I mean, what is the North Valley? And he says, oh, you know the North Valley. And this is, John Haverland is the kind of, drives a Buick and wears wingtips and always a gray suit, you know. And he said, well, you know the North Valley. He says, you got chickens scratching around in their front yard, you know. And so there's something about it here that it always felt very much, that St. Michael's was expressive of that spirit. And I think because of that, I know that you want to get to some of the welcoming around gay and lesbian and transgender folks. And it was just natural for that. I mean, there was a chapter of Integrity, the old Episcopal organization for gay and lesbian people back in the 70s, and I don't know whether it's still active or not, but our rector here, Peter Moore, my predecessor, was helping put that together with parishioners from here in the cathedral predominantly, but elsewhere too. But it was almost as if it wasn't needed here. I mean, by the time I got here, there were gay and lesbian people who were involved in things, and I was coming from San Francisco and seminary in Berkeley, and it was the late 70s. And to me, it was just completely natural that gay and lesbian people would be involved in every part of the church and baptizing their kids and everything else, and just be involved like anyone else. And so I came with that attitude, and I was frankly kind of surprised that New Mexico wasn't quite right up there with San Francisco in 1981, you know, and we just started acting on that kind of normality, and I think that kind of welcome, that everybody's welcome here, there wasn't, I recall very strongly remembering that, you know, people don't ask each other what they do for a living over coffee hour. It was just people here, and just people getting together. I don't know what more I can tell you about the welcoming when I first came. Do you have any? Joe, Jim.
Okay, we'll do a mic check, that's all right too? Yeah, okay, good. Many of you will remember when I was here that I often talked about my mentor, Ed Ostertag, the priest that I grew up with. And he died not long after I arrived here, and I officiated at his funeral down in Hillsboro, where Carla and I have a place. In fact, it's a house we bought from him. And when he was buried up in the Hillsboro Cemetery, the kids of the family picked up on an epitaph that was on one tombstone there already, a guy named Ruby Nave, and he had on his tombstone, "Further up the trail than most." And I was never quite sure what that meant, but Ed Ostertag's kids on his tombstone, echoing that, said, "Further out on a limb than most." Well, it will say a lot, therefore, when I say that Ed Ostertag was the first person who said to me, "You know, you should keep your eye on St. Michael's in Albuquerque, because it's a great parish." And so coming here, it really felt like that to me, that it was a parish that was out on a limb, on a variety of things, as Brian has just alluded to. So thinking about the experience of arriving and welcome, something I particularly remember is that that was the summer of 2015. And if you run that date through your mind a little bit, you'll remember that going into that summer, the Supreme Court had just established marriage equality as the law of the land. And soon thereafter, the Episcopal Church was meeting in General Convention and established marriage equality as the law of the church, our church at least. And so it was a really heady time coming into a parish that had been, in a sense, fighting for and struggling for something, and then just to feel the dam break and everything seemed to fall into place. So it was a very exuberant time, and very soon after I arrived, of course, we started to do a variety of weddings for gay and lesbian people who had been kind of waiting for that to happen. So it was euphoric, I think, might be the right word to describe those early days, just because it seemed like such a milestone had been achieved. But I'll leave it at that for now, because of course the story goes on and gets more complicated, doesn't it? But
Yeah, so I guess I would keep on this theme of welcome a little bit. You know, Brian, you talked about the kind of the DNA of the parish being, you know, chicken scratch North Valley, but also scrappy and I knew a lot about your time here because I was a kid for part of it, and I would visit my great aunt up on Solar. But what surprised me when I got here was seeing picture directories from even before your time with same-gender couples pictured together in the photo directory, and just thinking, wow, I mean, we really were out on a limb. We were ahead of our time at St. Michael's. In your time here, you welcomed a lot more people into the life of this church. What was that like as the congregation kind of grew up and grew out of the space where it had been worshiping? How did it keep its DNA while that was happening?
Well, it just did. I don't know what to say. I mean, it remained St. Michael's through the growth, and we grew rather rapidly in a short period of time, and part of the reason for that was because of the controversy that we were in. I mean, the Episcopal Church at the time was going crazy about, is it okay to say it's okay to be gay and lesbian? It was just, it's hard to imagine right now, but people were splitting off and threatening, and in this diocese that was going on very actively, and we were just standing up and being ourselves and got into trouble for that. And so we were known as a place where people were welcome, and we were known not only by the parish, but in the diocese, in the city, and nationally as well, for those who paid attention to those kinds of things in the Episcopal Church. And so that momentum was carried forward by the events that took place when the diocese came down hard on us at one point and withdrew a $400,000 construction loan for this building. And because we had a liturgy to welcome gay and lesbian people. And we got so much support for that, for our stance, and both locally and nationally, that people started arriving because they were curious. They heard about it. There was a little certain notoriety. At the same time, the Montaño Bridge was going through, and suddenly there were thousands of cars going by every day, and we became very visible, and this building was going up. And so it was like, what are they doing there? What are those people doing? And I think a lot of people came out of curiosity and because of what they'd heard. And so I think the DNA was able to continue because it was known, even to those, especially to those, well, even to those who were new. Yeah.
I guess it's interesting how much the values kind of align with one another, because it's hard to talk about the welcome of this place without talking about action. And so I guess, Brian, I'd ask you to continue on the theme. One of the ways I asked you to think about your time and the action around LGBTQ plus people is around how this place continued to be this place, right? Like, we all know the story of the bishop who tried to really squash what was going on here. But I wanted to ask you to tell that story from what was it like for the people here, and how did you all keep each other going? What was it that kept you persisting in the midst of that?
Well, I can't speak for any of you who were here at the time. You'll have to speak for yourselves. But for me, and in conversation with those of you who were here then, and others who are not here right now, but were very much a part of it, it was like, it was just a revelation of being afraid at first and feeling like we were going to get squashed and something bad was going to happen to us as a parish, and panicky about the money. And there was a little bit of conversation, didn't last long, about countersuing suing the diocese for enforcement of a loan that had been signed. And there were talk about lawyers and that sort of thing. And put on a fight these people, this is not right. And pretty quickly, some of us, including Jim Tryon, who was senior warden at the time, rector's warden, and Dick Elkins, who was the treasurer, and others in conversation, we came to the realization we had nothing to be afraid of. We would just go on being who we are, and we would not try to hide it, and we would talk about it and write about it, but not in a way that was trying to convince anybody of anything, or being defensive, or pointing out the faults of the people on the other side. We didn't want to do that. And the image that I had, it was just like being invited into a boxing ring and standing up and realizing, I don't have to be here. I'm going to leave this ring. So we just left the boxing ring and refused to fight. And at the same time, stood up for who we are by being positive about it. Like, this is why we do what we do. Let's talk about Scripture. Let's talk about what this means theologically. Why is it important to us? And we tried to stay, we were just very positive about it. At the same time, I was pretty adamant about continuing to try to show respect for the office of the bishop and for the diocese, and just sort of be above the fray. And it was like a form of nonviolent engagement, really. And it was a revelation to see, to remember how free one really is in those kinds of situations. Just be yourself. You got nothing to lose. What are they going to do? Take away your baptism? You know.
Canonically difficult, yeah. Yeah.
Also, I will say, the thing that helped me with that a lot was learning canon law. I mean, I probably knew canon law as it relates to the authority of rector and parishes and bishops better than most anybody I knew at the time, because I knew that they would come after me if I stepped over the line. So I didn't.
Yeah.
But I didn't let them step over their line. Mm-hmm. You know, I wasn't about to let that happen.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting. I mean, I've joked lately, it does feel like being the rector of St. Michael's, you have to learn a lot more about canon law than I've ever had to know before.
Yes.
But Joe, can you talk, I'll ask you to talk a little bit about the decision in your time, which is also a decision about welcome and action around immigration. What was that decision, and how did it play in the parish and the wider diocese?
Well, so after that euphoric summer of 2015, it seemed to me that the next question that was before us as a congregation is, if our identity was staked on the idea of welcoming and including everyone, was there someone who is not yet included in that welcome? How could we follow the trajectory that had already been established further, and where might it take us? And in a sense, that question became answered, I thought, for us when the euphoria of 2015 turned to the gloom and doom of 2016, specifically the election of the fall of 2016. I remember the Sunday after Donald Trump was elected president, the feeling here in the church was really like a funeral. There was a somberness to it, and a fear and an uneasiness. And I remember seeing people walk in with a kind of limp step, and there was just this shock about it. And unlike Brian, I was ready and willing to take some risks with canon law. And so we substituted a number of things during that service in order to address the situation we were in. For example, instead of doing the creed, which answers 3rd and 4th century questions of metaphysics, which didn't seem especially applicable that day, we read the Beatitudes. That was our creed that day. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who mourn. And that became our statement of faith, that we were going to be a congregation that would uphold the values of peacemaking and comforting the afflicted, and dealing openly and deeply with our grief and anxiety. And so then once the the new administration came to office, and immediately, as happened a second time around, started deporting immigrants. And everything that goes with that. It seemed fairly obvious that that question of where does the trajectory of full inclusion and embrace and respecting the dignity of every human being, regardless of which side of a river they might be born on, led us in the direction of trying to address that immigration problem. And one thing kind of led to another on that, as you may remember. At one point, if you recall, or for those who weren't here, this may be part of the history you haven't heard, but we were considering becoming a sanctuary church. That is, a place where undocumented immigrants could come and potentially be housed, with some idea that they would be sheltered from the threat of deportation. The legality of that is a gray area, but the congregation was not sure about that. There were some people on one end who thought that it was obvious that any person of Christian faith would naturally and inevitably want to do this. And then there were other people who said, yeah, but I don't know if it's legal, and I don't know if I'm ready to do that, and do we really know what we're doing? And so there was a discussion going on, and in the vestry, we made the decision that we would not proceed with becoming a sanctuary church until we felt like we really had consensus around that. And there was some doubt in the congregation whether we really meant that or not, but we did. And in the vestry, there was not unanimity either. Several vestry meetings, we went around the table, and each person expressed what they thought in their own heart and mind about this issue, and we discovered that we were not of a common mind. And we thought, well, we just can't take this step until we reach that point. So we committed ourselves to that. Well, then lo and behold, the issue in a sense resolved itself for us when we were asked to take in the Panzu family from Angola. Some of you may remember them. They were an African family that had escaped persecution there. And they were actually in the United States legally because they had applied for refugee status. And they were awaiting their hearing. And so we could take them in without becoming a sanctuary. So in effect, we were doing the same thing, but we didn't have that ambiguity of perhaps being outside the law. When they first came, it was the mom and 2 kids, and the father was in detention down in El Paso. And one of the big things that the committee that was supporting them managed to do is to get him released from detention. And he arrived here, and one of the sort of high points of that whole initiative was when we married them here in the church. They had been married according to tribal custom in Angola, but couldn't prove it, and they needed to be married for immigration purposes here in the United States. So we managed to get them a marriage license. We went to Bernalillo County, and they were kind of like, nah, I don't know if we can do that or not, because we didn't have birth certificates or whatever it was. But they said, go up to Sandoval County. They'll do it for you.
They'll do anything in Bernalillo.
So trusting the tip that we got, somebody went up to Sandoval County and got a marriage license. And we did the marriage on Sunday morning here in the church. And they were in traditional costume, and we did it in French because they were French speaking. And it was a really wonderful and joyous occasion. And I'll say one more thing and then let Mike push us along a little bit. But all of that also led into our involvement with receiving busloads of immigrants that were coming up from El Paso that were brought here by ICE, or whoever it was, the immigration people, some branch of it all. And they were being deposited in hotels, or we managed to work with the diocese and use the Bosque Center across the river, which was an old convent building, so it had lots of individual rooms. And we turned that into a staging a place to receive the busloads of immigrants and then connect them with their sponsors wherever they were in the United States, and then get them on a bus or a plane or a train and get them there, because they too were mostly seekers of refugee status. And usually within about 48 hours, we had everybody on their way. And it was a miraculous effort on the part of the parish. We had doctors step forward to provide medical care. We had legal people stepping forward with legal advice. We had some of the people who are involved in children's ministries provided games and toys for the children who were traveling with them. Everybody seemed to find something to do in the middle of that. And so that effort of receiving those buses and processing the people was an investment on the part of the parish that maybe reminds me to say this right now before I let it go, and that is going back to the idea of welcome, one of the things that I always felt here from the moment that I encountered the search committee in vestry, it was the quality of the lay leadership. I was always blessed with great wardens and vestry and treasurers, and it's a real testament to the strength of this parish. And I think it's what has enabled it to be resilient through times like Brian was describing, and then to take on some of the projects that we did during the age of immigration. So one little vignette about those buses, and then I'll finish. One of the buses had just pulled in, and the officer had gotten off the bus, and he came up, and I introduced myself, and the immigrants were about to come off of the bus, and he said to me, he said, "You know not to touch them, don't you?" And I said, "Oh, really? Oh, bienvenido." And and we just started shaking their hands as they came off and wished them welcome and showed them into the Bosque Center. So that was St. Michael's at work, yeah. That's great.
Pivoting a little bit from this overlapping vector of welcome and action, maybe to one around welcome and spiritual grounding. Brian, one of the stories about the growth around here, and you and I have talked about this not in our prep for this, but other times, is the story of the 9 o'clock service. Can you talk a little bit about the genesis of that worshiping community, which has become the largest service here at St. Michael's, and how that came about? What it was like worship-wise when you got here, and how that was built?
Well, we had, when I first arrived and for some time afterwards, we had an early morning service that was Rite 1 with all the these and thous and vouchsafe and beseech and so forth. And it was spoken. And then the later service was a choir with organ music and hymns. And it was, in that sense, it was pretty, I mean, a lot of Episcopal churches have done that and still do some. And we were growing a lot, and we needed more space, and we needed. So we thought, well, we'll do a third service. And I have a musical background, and I played a lot in ensembles and in bands, and mostly guitar and singing. And you know, being a musician through the 60s and 70s in the church, there was some dismal folk music, and it was really badly done and way outdated even then. You know, kind of Michael rowed the boat ashore with six people playing guitars all badly, and I sat through that for many years, and I thought, surely we can do better. And I wanted to do a service that was different from the early morning. Really, it was, in its own way, it was a contemplative kind of liturgy. I think those are, when they're often spoken and quiet early in the morning, and more formal language and so forth. And the later choir and organ and hymn model. And we wanted to do something different. And I hadn't really seen it done in churches because most people they were doing a contemporary service, which was really about 30 years out of date. And I thought, well, we can put together an ensemble. And I was having lunch with Jeff Olivet at Mary and Tito's on 4th Street, and there was the proverbial napkin and a pen, and we started talking, and Jeff has played in a lot of bands, and he's done a lot of ensemble work and read music beautifully and could direct a group. And I invited him to try to put something together with me. And so he drew some musicians together. We had a few instruments and a few voices, and it really was an instrumental vocal ensemble. We started looking for appropriate music for it, and discovered that the Gather hymnal, Roman Catholic, had a lot of good material in it that was high quality hymnody, that probably half of it that we were using at the time was early American and Celtic and other sources that weren't just 1960s and 70s folk music of American version. There were melodies that stood the test of time from different cultures. And so he started doing a beautiful job with the music, and I really believe that music has an enormous impact on the spirituality and worship life, and eventually the how many people you have in church. I mean, if you do a really good Sunday morning service with really good music, people are going to come, and they did. And it was very attractive, and it was very fresh, and it had a lot of quality, musical quality to it. So that was a big part of the kind of the spirituality that developed, and it took on its own character in terms of being informal but formal in terms of the vestments and the liturgy that you do, and a wonderful combination, because sometimes when you do that kind of a service, you think informal, and you kind of go all the way with it, and suddenly, you're as a boss of mine used to say back in the 70s, the kind of liturgy that was balloons and grab ass.
I don't know if we've got like the bleep feature for the YouTube. But
It can be formal and it can be informal at the same time. It can have dignity and it can have a sense of reverence and devotion and also be informal. And that's kind of that sweet spot that we hit. And people responded to it really well. And those who were part of it in terms of serving at the altar or singing in the music, playing in the music group or singing, took to that and really helped bring that into being and create its own kind of character.
Yeah. Joe, I would pitch you a similar question, which is, this church may have, across the three services, some of the more breadth of diversity of worship of anywhere I've experienced. How would you give that elevator speech to folks? And you had a little bit more liturgical freedom than I did in your time. The bishop had other priorities than worship, but how did you try to craft, you mentioned the Sunday of the election, but what were some other things that you were able to do with worship?
Well, I hesitate to bring this up because
Oh, come on, Joe.
because it was a disaster. But one of the things that I started to think about, given this whole theme of welcome and how everyone has a place at the table, and how we are all one, and that worship bonds us together, and all those kinds of themes, I got to thinking, is there something about our physical space that we could do that would help give expression to that? And I don't know if any of you all how many of you have served up here as liturgical ministers, but it always felt to me like there was a kind of audience and actor kind of dynamic to what we were doing, a little bit like what we're doing now. And we're very accustomed as people to watching things. We watch screens of all sorts. We watch sports, we watch performances, and in a sense, we watch church. So in the spring of 2018, so this is now a couple of years into the whole emphasis on immigration, it occurred to me that the pews were not bolted down. And if you kind of just took them and just kind of bent them this way a little bit, you would have an arrangement in which the congregation would be gathered together as one. And we did a couple other things. We moved the altar further out here, and we took the lectern and we put it back there facing this way. And that's when the icon got hung up there, because Jesus was over the word that was being read. And then we had a bowl of holy water here in the center, so that as people came to communion, they could bless themselves. And then we put the choir back here so that it really was sort of theater in the round, as it were. And it certainly wasn't a perfect arrangement by any means, but it did try and say something about what I thought we talked about as a congregation. It was trying to give some visual and experiential representation of that. It was not particularly well received. I remember one member of the early contemplative congregation getting about as far as the door back there with his hand on the handle to open it, the first Sunday we had done this, and he just looking through the glass said, "This is not right." So be that as it may, I mean, you can make arguments for all sorts of different kinds of things, but I did think that the important thing about all that was that I was finding that as we thought about and taught about, and as I and other clergy preached about the expanding circle of inclusion that we were talking about, especially through the work with immigration, that time and time again, I would kind of work through a sermon topic, and at the end of it say, this is yet another example of how living Christian faith is fundamentally countercultural to the society in which we live now. And again, this is thinking about that as the first Trump administration. You know, I remember preaching a sermon about the importance of truth, for example. And at the end of that saying, you know, the value that we Christians place on being truthful people and telling the truth is fundamentally countercultural to the society in which we live. Or preaching a sermon on respecting the dignity of people even if they are undocumented, or even if they are from another culture, or even if they are escaping violence and persecution. That if we respect that dignity, we are fundamentally acting in a countercultural way to the society in which we live. So that I mean, playing with the furniture was a kind of amusing exercise, but the deeper point was that of trying to say that rather than yet another experience of watching something happen that we kind of digest and take in, or to some degree, what if we really were gathered around a table as one? And what if, when Jesus said, "Do this in remembrance of me," the "this" that he was referring to, which is ambiguous if you think about it, the "this" he was referring to is gather at a table and share a meal together. And I remember Pepper Martz, a beloved memory, who used to sit right back there every Sunday. He was a retired Air Force colonel, I think, but he was a brilliant liturgist. And he always said that he thought the best way to express what Jesus meant when he said, "Do this in remembrance of me," is, "Do this and I will be at table with you." So I thought that trying to put the altar in the center of who we are picked up on that theme of Jesus being at table with us. So that was some of the thinking behind it. And that notion of gathering around a table where everyone has a place is fundamentally countercultural to the society in which we live, where we're divided in all sorts of different groupings now.
Yeah, I will say, my father-in-law came to visit in my first year here, and it took a good 20-minute conversation with him to convince him that the altar was never up over here at St. Michael's, right? Because the architecture of the building is sort of traditional with a chancel like that. But to call the question architecturally again, and to say, yes, in this church, the table is more at the center than in many Episcopal churches. There's not a mile-long aisle down the middle, but to say, you know, and to test the boundaries, I think sometimes is good. Let's slide over to the last value we've not talked about, which is spiritual grounding. One of the, Brian and I, many of you know, had a bit of a relationship before I came here, which is my first time as a rector. Brian came to lead a retreat in the diocese, and I asked him if he'd spend a year coaching me on the phone, and he agreed to that, and we talked for a good year. And one of the things that you told me in that time, which I won't share too many secrets, but was talking about some of that lay leadership that Joe mentioned, and how a rector in a healthy relationship with a congregation cannot lead everything. You can really pick one or two projects. What stuck with me about that was you named the Contemplative Center and the contemplative work here at St. Michael's as a big part of what you felt was one of your leadership projects. And I think at the time you didn't think that it outlived you here. And then when I got here, and Mandy had, after COVID, resuscitated the Contemplatives group on Thursday morning, but I almost wanted to write you right away and be like, no, Brian, they're still here. And they're still doing Buddhist meditative walks in the way they do contemplative life. But talk a little bit about like the nurturing of the contemplative soul of this place and the genesis of this kind of contemplative part of our life of Christianity together.
I think I'd broaden it a bit beyond the contemplative group and activities that we had. There were never more than about 10% of the congregation actively involved in our activities as a contemplative center. And so I think it was really spirituality in general that was more broadly shared in the parish. And when you asked me about this earlier and I was thinking about it, I had this memory of entering seminary without a whole lot of church experience. I grew up in the Episcopal Church, but I never was an acolyte or was never in the youth group and things like that. And it was really in my mid-20s a kind of an in-depth plunge into Christian spirituality, and a big fan of Thomas Merton and people like that, and going to monasteries and things that really led me to seminary, to the extent that they kind of looked at me and said, well, you're going to need an intern year in a parish somewhere. You haven't had a lot of church experience. And so I did that during seminary. But I just came from this place where, to me, that was the center of the whole thing. And it's not the only thing that matters in church, but for me, it was the heart of things, spirituality and the life of prayer, and contemplative as a particular style within that, but not all of it by any means. And when I got to seminary, I was really surprised because there were no courses in spirituality. There were no, the purpose was academic. And they were very upfront about that. We're not here to do spiritual formation with you. We're here to teach you academics of our tradition. And I was totally flummoxed. I just couldn't believe it. And fortunately, I was at a seminary in Berkeley that is part of the Graduate Theological Union, which has, 7 or 9, I can't remember which, seminaries of different kinds, including Jesuit and Franciscan. And I kind of went right over to them in terms of some of the courses, and also spiritual directors. And in our seminary, the only thing that was expected in terms of a spiritual life was go to chapel for morning and evening prayer most of the time, and if you don't, you're going to get a note from the dean in your box. That was it. And I thought, oh, we're going to talk about rule of life, all these things. No. So anyway, I had that expectation. I kind of got over that during the time that I was there and realized that it was something that, at least in this culture of the Episcopal Church, I needed to be on my own with and build on my own. And so when I came here, that was already in place, as I knew that it was something that was important for me, and it was important to the life of the church, and I was going to try to help build it here. And a lot of parishes don't have anything. They don't have much offering in the way of the life of prayer or meditation or icons, and it's more so now, but it wasn't so true in the early 80s. As I did that, I was thinking about this. I think when you ask somebody how they ended up in New Mexico or how they ended up staying here, half the time they're going to say something. They're not going to use the word spiritual, but I came here and there was something about it, and I just never left. And there's something kind of, it's related to the artistic temperament, I think. There's a lot of factors involved in that, but it was a conducive environment. Let me say that. There are a lot of places, if I had jumped in and said, okay, we're going to do all these spirituality things, I wouldn't have gotten as a warm a reception as I did here in New Mexico. And in the North Valley, which you might say was oriented a bit in that direction too. So those who are interested in that came here and stayed because of it and participated in various ways at various levels with the different things we did. And so we did retreats. The vestry used to have 2 retreats a year. One was a spirituality retreat, and it was a whole weekend off-site, like somewhere like Ghost Ranch. And the other one was a business retreat, and we did them every 6 months. And preaching, teaching, quiet days in the parish, weekend retreats that we do. And it just builds on itself. I mean, you start doing that, and people who are interested want to be a part of it, and they're here. And I was always very much in favor of encouraging lay leadership and hopefully recognizing gifts where they were coming up and giving them things to do with that. And so I didn't build it alone by any means. There are a lot of people, a lot of you, who participated in the spiritual grounding of this place in a whole variety of ways.
Yeah. Joe, I'm going to pick on you a little bit because in your, I would assume, former seminary dean hat, you were chuckling as Brian talked about. Say a word about, you've got a broad sense of the Episcopal Church, and we're part of the formation for a lot of seminarians. How is spirituality at St. Michael's different? How would you describe it as a charism for us if you put us up against the Episcopal Church?
Well, I think, like Brian was just saying, it seems like a natural and intuitive part of this congregation. It never has felt to me like something that has to be introduced from the outside artificially, but that it has been there to be nurtured rather than kind of brought in from the outside. And at the seminary, I was a bit astonished how few people there were that had an experience like Brian's of having had a deep spiritual life before they got to seminary. It was often very church-oriented, sort of institutionally oriented.
Yeah.
And trying to convince the students that the cultivation of their spiritual life was at least as important as their academic life, even at a place like Yale Divinity School. And we developed there a rule of life for the seminary that tried to emphasize that. And so coming into a parish that kind of naturally and instinctively had an implicit rule of life always felt very natural, reassuring, like a gift to to a pastor coming into a congregation.
Yeah, I would say I think when I was looking around the Episcopal Church, especially, I didn't get to go to Joe's seminary, though I wanted to. I got to go to Virginia Seminary, which ended up being a great place for me. But there, I mean, talk about an institution of the institution, right? I ran into a lot of people who I think were interested in being religious, not spiritual, as opposed to where I've always felt comfortable in congregations, felt more spiritual than religious, you know? So a place like this just felt so much more comfortable. I'd rather have people that want to argue about how long you should sit in contemplative prayer than whether right one or right two is the right language for God to hear you, right?
Yeah.
I wonder if we could open it up to some questions. We've got 5 or 10 minutes. If there are folks that want to ask a question, I'll repeat you for the people who are online, and then and let Brian and Joe answer. Any questions? David. So I'll repeat that real quick. David Odegaard is holding Joe's feet to the fire on the question of, and saying, very complimentary, you've made some significant liturgical changes when you were here. Talk a little bit about a few of them and why.
Well, it seems to me that liturgy always needs to be responding to the circumstance in which it is celebrated. Like what I was saying about the day after the election in 2016, we just couldn't have done an ordinary church service that day without some kind of embodiment of what people were feeling, some response to that, even though we got some pushback that we had been way too political. So it also seemed to me that as rich as the Book of Common Prayer is, that it is not the sum total of Christian worship, even of Anglican worship. And so we started to range fairly broadly about using other kinds of liturgical prayers, Eucharistic prayers. We borrowed from other parts of the Anglican Communion, from other churches that we're in communion with, like the Lutheran Church. There was a time when we were doing an Orthodox liturgy because of the richness of the language for that. In a nod to the same kind of idea that I talked about of being gathered together, we put the clergy over on the far side, or the liturgical ministers, I should say, over on the far side of the dais up here rather than up front, trying to emphasize that we're just all gathered around a common table. And then I suppose it would be important to acknowledge that no sooner had we gotten the furniture put back and everybody thought that, you know, all was well with the world again, that soon thereafter COVID hit. I mean, it was a year or two, but and then that blew the whole question of liturgy out of the water, because I remember the first Sunday we were here, 3 of us in the church, using some technology that they call Zoom. And in those days, Zoom couldn't handle music or anything other than the spoken word, and preaching to an church was, as you can imagine, an uncanny experience. And then along came, you know, that was in March, and we were talking about, well, by Pentecost, we'll be back. And Pentecost came and went, and they said, well, maybe by St. Michael's Day, and St. Michael's Day came and went, and then, well, maybe by Christmas, and Christmas came and went. And we were faced with the question of what do we do for Christmas when the church is locked up tight? And especially because it's an occasion when liturgical celebration is so important to people. So we brainstormed about all the varieties of ways we could tap people into some sort of experience of being together over Christmas and celebrating it even while being separated and apart. And some really creative things came out of that. The musicians put together a video of Joy to the World, where each person recorded their own version of it, and then somebody put them all together and they sang together as a choir. It was a technological miracle that came together. We read a play together by Dorothy Sayers. We did a poetry reading. Some of us listened to the lessons and carols coming from King's College, Cambridge, live. And so liturgy became something that really we were making it up as we went along, because nothing that we had in our up until that point was possible anymore. So that was a big influence on it, is COVID just stirred the pot of anything can be imagined and anything could be incorporated if it has that quality of addressing the circumstance in a way that brings it into the presence of God.
Maybe we're hungry. So, go ahead. Oh, Cindy Gillespie just says thank you, thank you. I guess I would pivot one last question to you both in terms of these values of welcome, action, spiritual grounding. As you imagine St. Michael's after your time, and then now as you see St. Michael's and you imagine us forward, are there any hopes or questions that you carry for this parish as it moves into its next 75 years or whatever God has for us?
An old seminary friend of mine that I've stayed in touch with said to me at one point when I was preparing to retire here, well, just remember, Brian, every parish is potentially one rector away from oblivion. I am very grateful to you, Joe, and to you, Mike, and to all of you, lay leaders, for continuing to grow and to challenge yourselves and to evolve and to be strong and yet still be the same. I mean, it feels the same to me in many ways. And those are qualities that are really important. And you kind of, sometimes in a parish you lose sight of what you're doing in terms of the impact. You think of it, well, we're this group of people and we meet here for worship and I know these people and so on. After years of being out of it, I looked back on it and thought, you really touch lives. I mean, you touch a lot of lives. And people who don't necessarily attend here, or they come once in a while, or they used to, or their grandmother was here and died, or whatever, you really touch a lot of lives deeply. And where else does that happen in our society? Where else like that? It doesn't. I mean, this is unique. And so please value it and please continue to evolve and grow.
On that note, I want to thank the three of you for how you have not only shaped this place, but the way that you have shaped all of us, and especially the two of us here. I've been here over 30 years now, and you have shaped us so much. You helped us grow. You've given us confidence. You've made us a spiritual community like no other. Thank you so very much.
We can't let Joe off the hook yet.
But one last thing, to answer your question directly, keep evolving. Don't, you have been and you will, and I just keep evolving and staying true to yourself at the same time. That's the kind of advice I'd like to give.
So I feel like I'm, in a sense, the luckiest of the three here because I both have my predecessor here who had set up so much for me to play off of and work with, and that was a rich gift. And I have my successor here who is continuing to help the parish evolve in new ways and to see things coming to pass. It's a great blessing in both directions. So thank you all for this. I would echo what Brian just said. You may remember that one of the images I had was drawn from a jazz mass that we did at the Divinity School, which was based on old hymn tunes that were transformed into jazz pieces. And it ended with the doxology. And it started out with the organ playing, you know, the old four-part harmony. Praise God from whom all seas flow. And we got to the end of that verse, and then all hell broke loose, and it turned into a piece of jazz music. And people were dancing in the aisles, and who knew that in the old hundredth, the doxology, there was hidden a piece of jazz. And I think that echoes what Brian was saying about the parish, about continuing to evolve and discovering the things that are within that may yet be hidden, but which will come forth with imagination and discovery and a sense of risk and being a little further out on the limb than most. So.
Before we close and I get to say my word of thanks, I do want to note that on that wall, and we won't permit it to stay up. I've worked in churches with a wall of rectors, and I'm grateful St. Michael's is not one of those. But for right now on the timeline, the rectors of St. Michael's are up, and the first one on that list was Paul Saunders, and Alita Saunders is here, and it is her birthday. So can we give
Hey!
So let me finish by saying it's a pretty unique privilege as the rector of an Episcopal parish to like your predecessors. I won't say more than that, but you can. These are two priests who I have admired for a long time. At Brian, since I was a kid, and women that he knew were coming up to my parish in Colorado and talking about this parish that was standing up to a bishop that was hostile. I then got to work with the first woman that Brian sent to seminary as my associate rector, Julie Graham, in St. Louis. And it is just an honor to get to have the same office door that Brian had. And Joe is somebody that I first knew when I was applying to seminary. I thought really highly of, and then I thought even more highly of when he was coming to the first parish that I served at, and would make the same faces at some of the same people that I would see from the committee he was on. And I thought, this is somebody who both has a lot of depth and a good sense of humor. And it is really a privilege to share Albuquerque with the two of you, though Joe's part-time in Hillsborough. It is really a privilege to have you around in the community, and it's especially a privilege to get to share this stage with you tonight. Thank you so much. Will you join me in thanking Brian and Joe? All right, so that we don't have to wait. God bless this food to our use and us to thy service. Keep us mindful of the needs and rights of others. Give us courage to do something about them. Amen. See you over at the food.